Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from AlexMercedCoder.dev, and in this video what I want to do is show you some use cases for using classes in JavaScript. At the end of the day, there's nothing you can't do in JavaScript, which is basic variables and functions and loops, but classes give you a really good tool for organizing your code and also reducing the duplication of your code, okay? Because instead of having a bunch of loose variables and functions just kind of all over the place, you can bundle variables and functions together in a way. And sometimes this gets lost in JavaScript because JavaScript is very unique that you can just create like a one-off object. Okay, like doing something like this, const obj, just creating a one-off object that, where I can say, hey, has a name, Alex Merced, and then has a function called greeting that const.logs hello, like creating this and then being able to just like use that and just be like, hey, obj console.log obj.name, and then be like obj.greeting. Like this is something that's kind of unique to JavaScript. In most other languages, I wouldn't be able to just make a one-off object like that. Okay, so node class use cases, that's pretty cool. In most other languages, just to even make one object like this, I would have to create a class first and then instantiate from the class. So that's why sometimes like you don't see class use as much in JavaScript. Not because object-oriented programming isn't useful or used, it's just that a lot of times you can kind of do many of the patterns just by just creating one-off objects. Like a lot of times you're just creating what's called a singleton, where you're just creating one single object. And in that case, you don't need to create a class for that. While in other languages, you would still have to create a class, even if you're just creating one object. Okay, so it's just a difference in the way JavaScript works. So just let me point that out first. So it's not that like, it's just that JavaScript gives you some ways to like short circuit the steps that other languages don't. And that has a lot to do with JavaScript's underlying architecture, where it applies an idea called prototypical inheritance. Not something I'm going to talk about right now. I do have a video called, Prototype Masterclass, if you want to want me to go down that rabbit hole. But just so you're going to see like why. So I'm going to just show you, we're going to assume that you can't do that in JavaScript and just kind of show you like those sort of traditional use cases. So one cool thing you can do in JavaScript is that every type of object that's built into JavaScript is essentially a type of object, and any object can be inherited, or basically is a class that can be inherited from. So I could do this. I could say class my array. So I'm going to create a special type of array that extends a normal array type. Okay? So this class is actually creating my own special kind of array because, arrays already have all these built-in functions, and I want to keep those functions, but maybe I want to add a function. Okay, like for example, I want to add a function to return a random item from the array. Because right now in JavaScript, there isn't a function built into arrays that gives you a random item. But why not? It's a pretty easy thing to do. So let's do that. So I'm going to add a method called, so in this myArray class, I'm going to add a method called random that literally all it does is basically it's going to generate a random index. So const index equals math.floor. And again, if you're not familiar with the logic of how you generate random numbers in JavaScript, not getting into that in this video, but this is basically the formula all the time. Math.random times the length of the array, which in this case, the array is this because the array is the object, because this is the array class we're altering. So this dot length. Okay, so in this case, I don't have to actually pass in the array as an argument because I can just use this because technically the array is the object. Because this is a method of my array. So in that case, that'll generate a random index based on the items in the array, and then we can just return this using the random index from that array. Cool. So now I've just created a new type of array that has this extra method. So now what I can do is, let's try this out. Const, my array equals a new my array. Let's push some numbers into it. So we'll say my r dot push 1, my r dot push 2, my r dot push 3. Okay, and then let's console log that array to see that those numbers get pushed in. And then let's actually use that random number function, my r dot random. Okay, let's see if all that works. And see, I created a new array. We'll see it's like my array, so it's a special type of array called my array, which has 3 items in it. And when I use the random function, it gave me a random item. And if I were to call this a few times, I should get different things each time. So we'll call it a few times. And you see I get different items each time. Okay, so I can extend the functionality of arrays. So if I have ideas like, oh, hey, you know what, why keep writing this function over and over again? Let me just build my own custom arrays that have my own, all these functions that I use all the time that I'll use across many different use cases. Let's just do that, okay? And that makes life a lot easier. So that's one use case for using classes, to actually extend any of the built-in object types that are already built into JavaScript. So I can extend arrays, I can extend maps, I can extend sets. You can extend anything if you really wanted to. Probably the most compelling use case is extending the array to add stuff like I just did. So that's one use case. So I'm going to comment this out though. And the second use case I'll go over is working with like a singleton. A singleton is just like, again, where you just need one object. I could just create an object with a bunch of functions, and that would work in JavaScript. But again, not every language has the ability to do that. So in a lot of other languages, this is where like static methods become really useful, because you don't want to have to like make a class, then have to instantiate it every time you just want to use a handful of functions. So let's say I want to do a class called random. Okay. But I don't want to have to be like, I don't have to actually create a random, because that's just, I only need one. This is just going to be like a big, the point of this class is just to have a bunch of random number functions ready to go. Okay. So that's really all I want. So like we'll do like random number, just generate a single random number. Okay. And this function will take in a number and then return a random number based up to that number. So return math.floor, math.random. And I mean the math object is actually a good example of a singleton. Essentially what the math object is kind of what we're doing with this random object. It's just going to be an object with a bunch of utility functions. Okay, and again, we want this to be a static method. Okay, math.random, math.floor times num. Okay, so just, there we go. That's going to generate a random number. And the cool thing is, because it's static, I don't actually have to go create a random. I don't have to do like const random equals new random. I don't have to do that. I can just use it straight up. I can just instead be like console.log random.randomNum, because static methods are functions that don't work on an instance, meaning I don't have to create an object. They're basically, they're methods of the class itself. So the class can work as its own object that has its own methods built in. Which again just saves you the step of having to use that new keyword. Again, really useful if you're using that singleton pattern where you're only creating one object, and that one object is all you need. I don't need to make 100 of these. I just need one. That one random object is going to have all the methods that I'll need to do different random number operations. Okay, so now let's just do this a few times. And I should actually pass out a number. 5. Cool, and it works. Okay, wonderful. Now I can keep building in more methods. So let's say I wanted to just have like a random number from an array here. So random from array. And then this time we do have to pass in the array because it's not a method of an array. It's its own separate object. So I pass it the array, and I want it to return, R, and then the index is actually this.randomNum. It's a random number based on the array's index, r.length. Okay, and that just is going to return. And see, like, and this is a nice thing where I have an array that does a function that does one thing, and then I'm using that function in another method, so that way this is less typing. So I don't have to write out that whole I don't have to write out this whole logic again because I have that already encapsulated in this function. So I can just use that function instead. Okay. And then I can do like another function for like random number through a range, random in a range, and we'll have like just two numbers. So minimum, max. Okay, so basically the way it's going to work is I'll use a while loop for this. So I'm going to say let num equal random num. I gotta think about this. Let num. So we're just gonna let the variable exist. Oh, I deleted the curly brackets. I've done this a few times. I was trying to think of like a simpler way for me to do this. Let num. There's a variable to hold the number. And then what I'm going to do is just create a loop for. Actually, we'll make this a while loop. While. And this is just going to be an infinite loop. I'm just going to make it an infinite loop. I'll break it from the inside. So that's going to be an infinite loop because true is always true. And then every time what I want to do is say let num equal random num based on the max, so the maximum number. But we want to make sure that it's not less. So if num is greater than or equal than the minimum, then what we'll do is we'll break the loop. Okay. And otherwise, we're just going to let the loop just keep choosing a random number until we break the loop. And then after the loop is done, we will return num. Okay. Oops, let me just get rid of that there because I already declared num over here. So essentially what happens is I declare this variable. And the reason I'm declaring it there is because, again, if I declare it here, then it'll only exist in the curly brackets. Again, block scoping. It'll only exist in the curly brackets in which it's declared. So I'd like to avoid that. Okay, and so let's just try this out. So let's do random in a range. So random in a range, and we'll say between 5 and 10. And let's do it a few times, see if it works. If I do it multiple times. Let's run the script. Hopefully I don't have an infinite loop. Nope, looks like something went wrong. Random num is not defined. This should be this dot random num. There we go. Let's try that again. And it works. So it generated me a number between 5 and 10. Cool. So see, now I have this random number object, and because all of these are static methods, they don't require me to create an individual object. I don't have to use that new keyword to create an individual random object. I can just use those methods right off the random class. So that's the benefit of like a static method. So yeah, I mean, these are just some ways where you can kind of like, again, group together. So right now in the early stages in JavaScript, where really classes are going to be a lot more useful when you actually start building applications, whether they're front-end applications where you're manipulating the DOM, usually using classes to represent chunks of your UI, aka a component, or in the back end where oftentimes you're grouping together similar routing patterns, also referred to as controllers, usually where you're bundling a bunch of functions in a class as a what's called a controller object. That's probably where you'll use it in JavaScript the most, or generally in web development the most. But again, you can always use classes to also just group together similar information or related functions and related functionality into a nice, easy to think of container. So that way, instead of me thinking of it as like a bunch of just random functions, it's all together in a nice package that I can kind of think through and latch my brain onto easier. So my name is Alex Merced. Have a great day and enjoy.